let's be entertained by the Liberal Democrat Manifesto, shall we? We've seen Ed Davey over the last 2 or 3 weeks falling into water in various different places across Britain, but they do actually have a manifesto, it seems. Lord Newby now joins me, who's a Liberal Democrat peer and leader of the Liberal Democrat group in the House of Lords. Lord Newby, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Pleasure.
So the manifesto is out, lots of pledges and promises in it. But before we get to that, can we talk about the House of Lords? It must be awkward, I guess, or difficult for those of you that are peers that are already in the Lords, when politicians that might be about to take the keys to Downing Street start talking about potentially either abolishing it or making it an elected chamber. What's your view? Are you one of the turkeys that might vote for Christmas?
Yeah, I am. It's been Lib Dem policy for a long time the House of Lords should be elected. I mean, one of our disappointments is that Labour aren't proposing to elect members of the House of Lords. They're proposing to have a retirement age and get rid of hereditary peers, which is a step in the right direction, but it's not far enough as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, Keir Starmer has talked in the past about abolishing it, hasn't it? But of course it serves his purpose, I think is what you're saying, particularly if it's true, as we've heard in recent weeks with regard to Diane Abbott and other left-leaning candidates being farmed out to pasture in the Lords as a kind of reward for stepping to one side. I suppose he can't really do that and then abolish the chamber, can he?
Well, that's a bit tricky. I mean, I think that nobody wants to abolish there being a second chamber. When people talk about abolishing it, they normally mean getting rid of an appointed House of Lords and electing it. Yeah. And as I say, we're in favour of that. We think in a democracy, the people who make the laws should be elected.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Lib Dem manifesto. So very, very comprehensive. I've read through it. There's lots and lots of bold stuff in there. And I have to say, things are going to cost a lot of money. I mean, there's pledges there, for instance, for free school meals for primary school children. There's pledges to build 150,000 council homes every year. Actually, you may have heard, we were just talking about football. Obviously, the Euro's starting today. I think Ed Davey would rather like to allow people to have free football on the television some of the time. So lots in there that's going to cost a lot of money, not least actually probably the biggest pledge, which seems to have escaped the attention of a lot of the media, which is Ed Davey talking about £10,000 given to every adult in Britain for the purposes of further education. I mean, that in itself is, by my calculation, about £300 billion. How is all this going to be paid for?
Well, just on that last point, that's an entitlement over people's lives. So it will give people the chance when they want it to retrain to get some support to do it. So obviously, in any particular year, most people won't take that up. So the cost is vastly less than you suggest. I mean, the manifesto is fully costed. There are a range of things. We think, for example, that some of those bits of the private sector, the banks, the oil companies and the water companies that are making massive profits should pay a bit more. We think that we should restructure capital gains tax like Nigel Lawson did, so that people who make massive gains in selling capital have to pay a rate of tax that's more like income tax. So yes, it does cost quite a lot, but we think it's perfectly possible to raise the money required without hitting ordinary folk in the pockets.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds a bit like the Labour philosophy, really, which is not to affect working people. But the flip side of that, of course, what it automatically therefore means is you're going to go after people that are somewhat more well off, whether it be individuals, companies, or indeed the oil companies. And obviously the oil companies are very, very tempting to go after. But of course, there is already a wealth tax. And I know the Lib Dems are proposing a one-off wealth tax. But the problem, I guess, with that is twofold. Firstly, if you continue to tax corporate entities, they may just go and domicile somewhere else. That's obviously a big danger. But also the fact that they're already making most of their money offshore. So are we sure those numbers add up in terms of this one-off wealth tax being almost the route to paying for all of this stuff?
Yes, we are. And in particular, the bank levy, which we're talking about, which is the biggest single one of those, is really only reinstating what was in place before the Tories got rid of it. And bear in mind, with interest rates a lot higher than they have been in recent years, the amount of profit the banks make, the spread between the amount they charge for having a loan and the cost of giving out interest to people, that spread's increased, so their profits have increased. So, yeah, we are very confident about the figures. We just think you need the courage to do it.
Well, yeah, courage, I guess, and also the honesty. I mean, perhaps you could argue then that your manifesto is a bit more honest than Labour's, would you say? A previous guest just now, I was discussing the fact that the Labour Party seem to be pledging not to increase tax, but not saying that they won't increase tax elsewhere. So I guess by comparison, you're being quite honest, aren't you, compared to Labour?
Well, I mean, I think we try to be honest, because I think the real problem at the minute in British politics is that people don't trust politicians. And so we want to make sure that if we say we're going to do something, we explain how we can do it. I mean, my criticism of the Labour manifesto is it's just so lacking in ambition. I mean, you can't possibly, it seems to me, sort out the absolute crisis in the NHS and only spend a very, very small amount of money on it, which is what Labour are proposing.
And what did you make of what Angela Rayner hinted at yesterday in the debates, where she actually talked about using the private sector with regard to being part of the solution to resolving waiting list problems in the NHS? That was quite surprising.
Yeah, but I mean, that already happens. So I've had cataract operations recently done in a private sector facility near where I live under the NHS. So I mean, yes, I agree with Angela Rayner to the extent that if there is capacity in the private sector that's underused, it should be being used productively for the NHS. But the trouble with that, even if you did that, it doesn't solve all the problems. And if you're going to do more operations, it's going to cost more money.
Yeah.
So I don't think I mean, it's part of a solution potentially, but by no means the whole solution.
And your policy of recruiting an extra 8,000 GPs, I mean, sounds laudable, and I don't think there's any argument that we need more, particularly as some find it very, very difficult to get an appointment at all. How are you going to find 8,000 GPs?
Well, you've got to do it in various ways. First of all, quite a lot of people GPs have left the profession because of the stresses placed on it. Quite a lot of new trainees who could be GPs are going to work abroad, and not enough people are being trained. So you've got to if you put a bit more resource into the system, take some of the pressures off GPs, for example, by allowing pharmacists to do more. You make it easier for people to be a GP, and therefore you're less likely to have this terrific leakage we have now of people moving abroad and people retiring early.
Well, I was going to say a lot of people in the medical profession have left to go, I mean, famously to Australia and New Zealand. Is there a way of incentivising them back, or is it just a question of who pays the most attracts the staff, which would seem rather at odds with what I would say is the kind of the ideology of someone in the medical profession should be one of helping people rather than chasing a dollar, shouldn't it?
Well, I think the reason that quite a lot of people have gone to Australia isn't particularly the money, although that may be partly. I don't think that's the real reason. I think they think that the working conditions and the pressures are going to be less, and for being a GP in Australia is just not such a stressful occupation as it is here.
Yeah, let's talk about the EU, because it's one of the standout differences between you and many of the other parties, apart from the SNP. So Stephen Flynn in the debates yesterday was really wearing migration and the EU on his lapels, really, in that he absolutely favours rejoining the EU in an independent Scotland, which seems somewhat ironic, doesn't it, really, that from an SNP point of view, you want to be independent from England, but you also want to be part of the EU. But anyway, leaving that aside for 1 second, the Liberal Democrat policy is to rejoin the EU, despite the fact that we've already had a referendum on it.
Yeah, the Lib Dem policy is that we should rebuild our position at the heart of Europe. We can't simply rejoin the EU. It's not like rejoining a golf club. At the moment, people across the EU, governments have no trust in the UK. So even if we wanted to do, they're not very keen to have us back. What we've got to do, though, given the massive costs that being out of the EU impose on the economy, we've got to rebuild our economic ties. We've set out a step-by-step approach towards rejoining the single market, and eventually, when the conditions are more congenial to it, to rejoining the EU. And I make absolutely no apology to that. Leaving the EU has made us poorer, less
But Lord
secure,
Newby, has
less
it
peaceful.
has it though? I don't know if there's any evidence to that effect at all.
Oh,
I
there
mean,
is
in
lots
fact,
of evidence.
I mean, but Germany's in the EU and they're paupers by comparison in terms of their rate of GDP growth. Their economy is on
But
its
they're not
knees compared to ours.
Yeah, but they're not paupers by comparison in terms of how much they earn per head.
But we're
And
now one of the 4 or 5 biggest exporters of manufacturing goods in the world.
with
Our
all
GDP is growing, whereas a lot of other European countries
our
are growing less
GDP
so.
is, frankly, our GDP is flat. And over the period since we left the EU, look at what's happened to our trade compared to trade everywhere else. Ask somebody who is a small business who was trading goods with Europe if they're still doing it. A very large proportion aren't doing it at all.
Well,
Because
no, but that, with respect, that would be kind of somewhat anecdotal. I'm talking about the actual data,
not anecdotal.
statistics,
It's not in
data
the
that says that
slightest.
this prophecy of Brexit having made us poorer, I just don't see any evidence for it. In fact, I see
there
evidence
is.
to the contrary. Well, where? Can you point me to it?
Well, I don't want to sort of direct you to particular bits of page X of this report or Y of that report, but if you look at what's happened to the growth of trade across all the developed countries since 2016, they all mirror each other, more or less.
No, but we're ahead of many in Europe, Lord Newby. We're ahead of many economies in Europe.
Yes, because that's what we're larger, and because traditionally we've been a trading nation. We haven't stopped being a trading nation. All I'm saying is, since we left the EU, our trade has grown less quickly than most European countries and other competitors like the US and Japan.
But isn't it a question also, if we produce goods and services that are competitive and desirable, it doesn't matter because people are going to buy our Range Rovers and our Fortnum and Mason picnic hamper baskets anyway, aren't they? So it's a question of competitiveness rather than EU rules.
But it's also, no, because if I'm sending goods to Europe as a small business, I have got to fill in forms, I've got to pay facilitation fees, and look at it the other way around.
Well, it's a tariff issue, isn't it? Maybe if there were no tariffs at all, regardless, it would be it would be a level playing field.
Not a tariff issue. We don't have any tariffs. It's the costs of doing business. And if you're outside a customs union, it costs you something to trade into it. And because there's been such a big drop in the number of small businesses trading with Europe, the evidence is there. And the equal evidence is if you try and import stuff from the EU as an individual, very often you're hit with massive administrative charges which simply weren't there before.
All right, well, let's talk about the premise of let's talk about rather than the minutiae around the EU, the kind of whole Brexit debate. I mean, you're taking quite a risk, aren't you? Because on the one hand, declaring that you want to re-enter the EU is very, very different to just about all of the other parties. I mean, the Labour Party said unequivocally last night, Angela Rayner was asked directly, will you re-enter the EU? And she said no. So despite the fact that Keir Starmer was probably the biggest advocate of a second referendum, the Labour Party have kind of nailed their colours to the mast. You're saying very clearly and honestly, in fairness, that you will. But it's a kind of binary choice for a voter then, isn't it? So I mean, do you think you're going to pick up votes more than you would lose as a consequence of having that honest stand?
Well, bear in mind, what we're saying is we don't think rejoining the EU is a feasible option in the near term, but in the longer term, that's what we want to do. Look at the opinion polls. A majority of the British public now say they wish they were members of the EU. So I don't think we're taking a risk in advocating.
But Lord Newby, the polls were famously wrong in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, weren't they? Even Nigel Farage conceded, I think, about an hour before the actual result that he'd lost because of what the polls were saying. So again, we talked about polls today and the fact that they are rather squiffy. They're all over the place. So yeah, I'm not sure the polls are much to go by when it comes to what people think about the EU, particularly because it depends who you ask and how you ask them. Lord Newby, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's a very helpful bit of clarification, I think, in terms of what the Liberal Democrats are saying in the run-up to the election, and indeed some of the costs, and there are some big costs in the Lib Dem manifesto. In fact, if you look at the tax burden that is now being forecasted, depending on which party you end up voting for, depending on which one would end up in office, the Lib Dems are right up there with the Greens, I think, in terms of the additional burden as a consequence of some of the things that they are suggesting.